The year was 1964. In a modest office in Oregon, two men, Bill Bowerman, a track coach, and Phil Knight, a former athlete with a business degree, launched what would become a revolution in athletic wear. They called it Blue Ribbon Sports. But it wouldn't be long before they found a new name, a name drawn from the Greek goddess of victory, Nike. From the very beginning, it was never just about shoes. It was about movement, about culture, about turning sport into identity, and identity into profit. Nike wasn't the first to make sneakers, but it was the first to sell aspiration. Under Phil Knight's relentless vision, the brand transformed itself from a track and field supplier into a cultural juggernaut. The secret was in the marketing. While other companies focused on features, Nike told stories. They wrapped their products in emotion, rebellion, triumph. The swoosh became more than a logo, it became a flag, and people saluted it. By the 1980s, Nike had signed basketball legend Michael Jordan, creating the Air Jordan line and launching a billion-dollar legacy. Just Do It echoed across television stadiums and playgrounds. By the 1990s, the company was dominating global markets, not just in sportswear, but in streetwear, music, and youth identity. It wasn't a brand, it was a movement. But behind the sleek commercials and the multi-million-dollar athlete endorsements, there was another side to Nike. One the ads didn't show, a side hidden in the industrial zones of Asia, behind barbed wire, beneath tin roofs, in factories filled with the echo of sewing machines and the smell of glue. Because while Nike was selling dreams in the West, it was building them on the backs of the world's most vulnerable. The shift began quietly as part of a broader trend in American manufacturing. To keep costs low and profits high, companies outsourced production to countries where labor was cheap and regulation was weak. For Nike, this was not a reluctant move, it was a strategic one. By the late 1970s, Nike had ceased manufacturing its own shoes entirely. Instead, it became a design, marketing, and distribution powerhouse. The actual production, the stitching, gluing, and cutting, was handed over to subcontractors in countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, China, Vietnam, and the Philippines. At first, few people noticed. The shoes arrived in Western stores immaculate and bright. The athletes wore them. The kids begged for them, and the profits soared. But beneath the surface, a different reality was unfolding. In Indonesia, workers, many of them young women, were stitching Nike shoes for less than $2 a day. They worked in stifling heat, under abusive supervisors, with little access to water or breaks. In Vietnam, laborers were punished for minor mistakes, denied overtime pay, and subjected to conditions that violated international labor standards. In China, factories operated with military-like discipline, and safety was a distant concern. Reports began to surface of toxic chemicals, illegal child labor, forced overtime, and intimidation. For a long time, Nike denied everything. The company insisted that it didn't own the factories, it merely contracted them. What happened inside was not their responsibility. It was a defense that would come to define an era of global capitalism, plausible deniability, cloaked in supply chains too complex to trace. But as globalization accelerated, so did awareness. In the early 1990s, journalists began investigating. Academics raised questions. Non-profits started tracing products from store shelves back to the factory floors. And in 1996, Life magazine published a photo that changed everything. A young boy in Pakistan hunched over stitching a Nike soccer ball. The image was grainy, but the message was crystal clear. Child labor was helping make Nike products. Public outcry exploded. Activists took to the streets. College students staged sit-ins and boycotts. News outlets began running exposés. Celebrities spoke out. And for the first time, the myth of Nike was under siege. The company that sold empowerment was now associated with exploitation. The slogan, "Just do it," took on a darker tone. Nike responded at first with silence, then with defensiveness. Executives claimed they were being unfairly targeted. They pointed to charity donations, community outreach. They insisted their hands were clean. But behind closed doors, they were scrambling. Sales began to falter. Public relations teams were overwhelmed, and investors started to ask hard questions. In 1998, facing mounting pressure, Phil Knight took the stage at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., and did something few expected. He admitted failure. The Nike product has become synonymous with slave wages, forced overtime, and arbitrary abuse, he said. I truly believe the American consumer doesn't want to buy products made under abusive conditions. It was a rare moment of corporate accountability. But words alone weren't enough. The damage had been done, and the real question lingered: would anything change? What followed was a decade of promises. Nike published codes of conduct. They opened factory audits. They created transparency reports. They joined ethical labor initiatives. They even allowed independent watchdogs into select facilities. The company launched sustainability campaigns, highlighted female empowerment, and invested in educational programs. To the casual observer, it looked like redemption. But beneath the polished press releases and CSR videos, deeper problems remained. Inspections were often scheduled in advance, giving factories time to prepare. Whistleblowers were intimidated or fired. Subcontractors learned how to hide violations. And the global race to the bottom continued. As wages rose in one country, Nike shifted production to another with cheaper labor and looser laws. From South Korea to Indonesia, from Indonesia to Vietnam, from Vietnam to Ethiopia. The geography changed. The story did not. In a cramped dormitory in Tangerang, Indonesia, the air hung thick with glue and heat. The room was lined with bunk beds, crammed with young women, most of them barely adults, many of them teenagers. They worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, making shoes for a company whose name they would never forget: Nike. They earned less than $2 a day. They stood for hours. They inhaled chemical fumes. And when the bell rang, they obeyed. Her name was Sari. She was 17 when she first walked through the gates of the factory. She didn't know what Nike was. She only knew her family was hungry and the factory offered work. The training lasted 1 day. After that, it was production quotas, painkillers, and silence. Talking during work was forbidden. Bathroom breaks were timed. Mistakes were punished with yelling docked pay and sometimes slaps across the face. She remembered the day a girl fainted at her machine. They dragged her out and told everyone to keep working. Sari's story wasn't unique. It was echoed in interviews conducted by labor activists, NGOs, and journalists across Southeast Asia. In Vietnam, a woman named Lin told of how her fingers bled from stitching shoe soles for 10 hours straight. In China, a former factory worker named Chen recounted how his supervisor would reduce meals to a single bowl of rice as punishment for falling behind schedule. In Cambodia, a girl named Dara described how she lost consciousness from heat stroke on a factory floor with no ventilation. Each testimony added another crack in Nike's polished brand image. And yet for years, they were dismissed, ignored, or spun into corporate jargon. We're working to improve conditions. These are isolated incidents. We don't own the factories, but the truth was systemic. Nike had perfected a model of production that relied on the invisibility of suffering. Through layers of subcontracting, it could disassociate itself from labor abuses while retaining control over prices, deadlines, and quality. The contractors bore the cost. The workers bore the pain. Nike reaped the profits. The pressure to produce more for less was relentless. Factory managers were given strict deadlines and cost targets. Missing either could mean losing the Nike contract. And so to keep margins intact, they cut corners. Safety equipment was denied. Wages were kept below legal minimums. Workers were forced to sign false timesheets or forbidden to form unions. The goal wasn't efficiency, it was compliance. Compliance with a global brand that promised excellence while demanding silence. And that silence was protected not just by distance, but by fear. When workers tried to speak up, they were threatened. In Vietnam, a group of employees who attempted to organize a strike were fired and blacklisted. In Indonesia, an undercover journalist found herself followed by men who claimed to be community observers. In China, a factory employee who reported labor violations to local authorities was assaulted and hospitalized days later. These weren't coincidences. They were part of a system built to suppress dissent. But the silence didn't last forever. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a movement began to stir. College campuses across the United States erupted with protests. Students occupied Nike-sponsored athletic departments. They demanded divestment transparency and ethical sourcing. Organizations like the United Students Against Sweatshops and the Worker Rights Consortium exposed Nike's factory practices through leaked reports and undercover footage. And then came the whistleblowers. One of the most prominent voices was Jeff Ballinger, a labor rights activist and researcher who spent years investigating Nike's supply chain. He published detailed reports on wages, labor laws, and human rights violations in Nike-contracted factories. His work became the backbone of the anti-sweatshop movement. He showed the world that Nike wasn't just unaware of the abuse, it had built a system that made it inevitable. Ballinger's research was followed by that of journalists like Naomi Klein, whose groundbreaking book No Logo dissected the rise of brand culture and its reliance on outsourced labor. Klein argued that companies like Nike weren't manufacturers anymore, they were marketers. The product wasn't the shoe, it was the logo. And the logo was designed to obscure, not illuminate. By the mid-2000s, the pressure on Nike became impossible to ignore. The company released factory lists for the first time. It joined ethical supply chain initiatives. It conducted third-party audits. It began promoting corporate social responsibility. But critics were skeptical, because even as Nike pledged change, the reports continued to tell the same story. In Bangladesh, workers sewing Nike apparel were paid pennies per garment and denied bathroom access. In Honduras, laborers described verbal abuse and harassment by supervisors. In Vietnam, audit reports revealed that factories routinely falsified timesheets to hide illegal overtime. And in Ethiopia, where Nike had recently shifted production to escape rising wages in Asia, new reports emerged of underage workers and 14-hour shifts. The shift to Africa wasn't accidental, it was calculated. As wages and scrutiny increased in Asia, Nike looked to newer markets, less regulated, less visible, more desperate. The formula remained unchanged: enter poor country partner with local factory produce, cheaply deny accountability. And yet, even as the evidence piled up, consumer culture barely flinched. Nike was still sponsoring the biggest athletes in the world: Serena Williams, LeBron James, Cristiano Ronaldo. The shoes still sold out within hours of release. Air Jordans, Air Max, Vapor Max. Hype culture thrived. Sneakerheads camped out overnight for limited edition drops. Celebrities flaunted collaborations. Influencers unboxed on camera. And through it all, the human cost remained hidden, buried under layers of design and desire. The machine hadn't stopped. It had evolved. Nike learned how to absorb criticism, rebrand, and move forward. It invested in storytelling, in identity, in aligning itself with progressive values. It released social justice-themed ads, highlighted female empowerment, and partnered with Black Lives Matter supporters. It became not just a brand of performance, but of politics. But critics saw through the smoke. How could a company that championed equality in its ads continue to exploit labor across the global south? How could it speak of empowerment while denying workers the right to organize? How could it sell progress while outsourcing suffering? By the early 2000s, Nike had weathered its most visible public backlash. The protests had calmed, the headlines had faded, and in the boardrooms of Beaverton, Oregon, executives breathed a sigh of relief. The company had survived its sweatshop scandal, or at least that's what the marketing said. In truth, the scandal had not disappeared, it had metastasized. Because at the core of Nike's global empire lay a strategy so elegant, so ruthless, and so profitable that walking away from it was never an option. It was a system built on externalizing costs, offloading the risks, the responsibility, and the human suffering, while internalizing the rewards. And it began, as all things do in global capitalism, with price. To produce a single pair of Nike sneakers costs on average between $20 and $30. That figure includes materials, labor, packaging, and shipping. But that same pair of sneakers can retail for $150, $200 or more. The gap between production cost and sale price is vast, and Nike fills that gap with narrative. The value isn't in the leather, it's in the logo, in the air bubble, in the association with athletes' rebellion and style, in the illusion of performance. But in order to maintain this illusion while keeping costs low, Nike needed absolute control over its supply chain without taking responsibility for it. So Nike became a master of offshore contracting. Rather than own factories, it partnered with manufacturers in the global south, privately owned companies that were desperate for business. These factories bid for Nike contracts, and Nike played them off each other. If one factory couldn't meet cost demands or deadlines, another would. If wages rose in one country, Nike moved to another. It was an endless race to the bottom, and the workers were always the last to benefit, if at all. In Indonesia, a factory could be cut off overnight if it raised wages by a few cents. In Vietnam, an increase in union activity might prompt Nike to shift orders elsewhere. These weren't empty threats. They were policy. Nike had no loyalty to location, only to margins, and so the factories bent over backward to comply. To win contracts, they accepted punishing delivery schedules. They underpaid their workers. They forced overtime. They ignored labor laws. In some cases, they falsified compliance reports just to stay in Nike's good graces. The company claimed ignorance. But the truth was clear: the pressure to cut costs came from Nike, and the abuse was a predictable result. Meanwhile, Nike's own employees, those working in design, marketing, and logistics, operated in a world of data and control. Sophisticated forecasting software allowed Nike to predict demand, adjust production, and fine-tune supply chains with precision. The company invested heavily in logistics, warehousing, inventory tracking, global freight management. It built a just-in-time delivery model that minimized waste and maximized speed. But what was fast for Nike was grueling for the people making the products. Orders could surge with little warning. Factories scrambled to meet deadlines, often extending shifts into the early morning hours. Workers were kept in cramped, poorly ventilated spaces exposed to toxic glues and solvents. Protective equipment was rare. Breaks were limited. And when quotas weren't met, the punishment wasn't corporate, it was personal. Supervisors screamed. Wages were docked. Workers were shamed in front of their peers. Nike knew this. Audit after audit confirmed it. But the company learned to game the system. When human rights groups demanded transparency, Nike published codes of conduct and launched CSR initiatives. But audits were announced in advance, giving factories time to cover up violations. Some even created clean rooms where well-trained workers pretended to represent the broader workforce. Others kept two sets of records, one for auditors, one for reality. And when violations were uncovered, Nike's response was almost always the same: "We take this very seriously," followed by a promise to investigate. Occasionally, contracts were suspended, but more often, they were quietly renewed. The offending factory changed names. The problem was rebranded. The system rolled on. At the same time, Nike flooded the market with image campaigns. Ads showed empowered female athletes' communities, rising through sport children in underdeveloped countries, learning to dream through basketball. The contradiction was staggering. The very same brand profiting from abused workers in Asia was promoting equality and liberation in its commercials. The public, for the most part, didn't ask questions. The shoes were still stylish. The celebrities still endorsed them. And the price still justified the purchase. Meanwhile, Nike executives reaped the rewards. Phil Knight's net worth soared into the tens of billions. CEOs were rewarded with performance-based bonuses, stock options, and golden parachutes. In 2021, then CEO John Donahoe earned more than $32 million in a single year, more than most of Nike's overseas workers would see in a lifetime. Shareholders were happy. Wall Street cheered. But not everyone stayed silent. A growing chorus of economists, journalists, and activists began to trace the deeper implications of Nike's model. It wasn't just a labor issue. It was a systemic one. Nike had helped pioneer a new kind of capitalism, one where the brand held the power, but none of the accountability, where the product was secondary to the story. where a 5-hour sweatshop worker in Vietnam could be linked by supply chain to a $250 sneaker drop in Manhattan and yet remain invisible in the brand narrative. And this model had consequences. It suppressed global wages. It weakened labor protections. It empowered governments to turn a blind eye to abuses in exchange for foreign contracts. It created a world in which multinational brands dictated the terms of employment, while local communities bore the burden, and all of it was perfectly legal. In many ways, that's the most haunting part of the story. Nike didn't need to break laws to exploit people. The laws were written to permit it. Trade agreements favored corporations. Labor protections were poorly enforced. Global courts were inaccessible to the powerless. And in this vacuum of justice, Nike thrived. In a sparkling showroom in Manhattan, a new Nike flagship store opens its glass doors. Screens flash inspirational quotes. Mannequins wear sustainable fabrics. Tablets offer custom sneaker designs. From the ceiling hang banners touting zero-carbon goals and community impact. A mural on the wall celebrates women in sport. At the center of it all, the swoosh gleams sleek, modern, unstoppable. To the casual observer, this is a company that has evolved. A company that heard the protests of the 1990s, acknowledged its sins, and changed course. A company committed to equity, to sustainability, to social justice. But beneath the polished wood and recycled plastic, the question still echoes: what really changed? In 2020, Nike was ranked among the world's most sustainable brands. It released annual corporate responsibility reports filled with charts pledges and smiling factory workers. It joined international initiatives aimed at improving labor rights. It promised to cut emissions, reduce waste, and source materials ethically. It published factory lists, partnered with watchdogs, and even launched its own circular fashion platform, Nike Refurbished. But dig beneath the surface and a familiar story begins to re-emerge. In 2022, a report from the NGO Clean Clothes Campaign alleged that garment workers producing Nike apparel in Cambodia and Thailand were still owed months of unpaid wages lost during the COVID-19 pandemic. These weren't isolated factories. They were active Nike suppliers. The company claimed that because it didn't own the facilities, it couldn't be held accountable. The workers saw it differently. To them, the logo on the clothing meant something. It meant power. And with power came responsibility. In Ethiopia, investigative journalists uncovered that workers making Nike shoes were being paid as little as $26 per month, less than $1 a day. These workers lived in makeshift dormitories, far from their families, bound by contracts they didn't fully understand. When asked about the wages, Nike said it had exited the factory in question, citing alignment with long-term sourcing strategy. No apology, no reparations, no acknowledgement of the broken promises. In Vietnam, where Nike continues to produce millions of shoes every year, labor organizations revealed that many workers still suffer from overwork, intimidation, and poor ventilation. In one case, a woman collapsed after working 13 consecutive hours in sweltering heat. The incident never made headlines. It was logged in a local complaint file, marked resolved. Nike's own audits tell a damning story. In their 2021 factory report, over 25% of reviewed facilities were found to have critical or high-risk labor violations. The numbers improve each year, but the definitions change too. And because Nike conducts many of these assessments internally, or with friendly third parties, transparency is murky at best. And yet the brand thrives. Nike's revenue in 2023 surpassed $50 billion. Its influence in culture unshaken. Its ad campaigns progressive, emotional, inclusive. It released limited edition sneakers honoring George Floyd. It partnered with LGBTQ+ athletes. It ran campaigns on climate change, female empowerment, and anti-racism. It said the right things. It showed the right faces. But in the factories, the pace never slowed. A former worker in Indonesia, now in her 40s, reflected on her 2 decades stitching Nike shoes. "We made Jordans," she said. "We never saw one. We never touched the box. But we were told they were for someone important." She laughs, but there's no joy in it. We knew our hands weren't. Nike has learned to tell powerful stories, but it hasn't learned to share power. The problem is systemic, and not just within Nike. The fast fashion and sportswear industry as a whole remains addicted to cheap labor and disposable production. The public, lulled by greenwashing and social branding, has largely moved on. The sweatshop scandal faded not because it was resolved, but because it was repackaged. Today, Nike talks about resilience, about circular economies, about ethical innovation. But the average wage in many supplier factories remains barely above the poverty line. Union busting continues, gender discrimination persists, and the barriers to justice for the people who make the clothes are as high as ever. There is no global court where a factory worker in Cambodia can sue a CEO in Oregon. There is no supply chain transparency dashboard that shows exploitation in real time. There is only noise data pledges, press releases, and in that noise, the system endures. But it doesn't have to. Across the world, a new generation of activists, journalists, and workers are fighting back. They're organizing across borders, sharing stories, tracking supply chains, demanding that sustainability mean more than green labels, that equity mean more than ads, that justice mean more than silence. Some brands are listening. A few are experimenting with real transparency, blockchain tracing, worker profit-sharing, public audit trails. But Nike, despite its wealth and influence, has not led this movement. It has followed it, cautiously, selectively, strategically. Because to lead would mean giving up control, rethinking margins, centering the people behind the product. And that is not yet part of the plan. As consumers, we are not powerless. Every purchase is a choice. Every logo we wear is an endorsement not just of design, but of behavior. We have been taught to believe that a shoe can make us fly, that a brand can make us whole. But the truth is more grounded and more urgent. The swoosh is not just a symbol of speed. It is the trail left behind when something moves too fast for the world to catch. But we are catching up. And we remember, the sweatshop scandal didn't end. It evolved, and so must we.